I've lived in Stonebrook Estates for 5 years, long enough to know that the HOA here operates more like a monarchy than a homeowners association. My name is Daniel Carter, and I've never been one for neighborhood politics. I keep my lawn trimmed, my trash bins out of sight, anything to stay off the HOA's radar. But that morning I walked outside and saw an orange violation notice stuck to my windshield. Unauthorized parking, vehicle subject to removal. I frowned. This was my designated spot. But across the street, Meredith Langley, HOA president, stood with her arms crossed, smirking. She did this on purpose. I pulled the violation notice off my windshield, my stomach twisting with irritation. This had to be a mistake. I owned my home, and with it, the designated parking spot right in front of it, the same spot I'd been using for years. But the fine print on the notice said otherwise. HOA property, permit required. I turned to face Meredith Langley, who still stood watching me from across the street, her smirk unwavering. The HOA president was infamous in Stonebrook Estates. She ruled the neighborhood with an iron grip, enforcing fines for mailbox placement, trash bin timing, and even the shade of outdoor furniture. But this was new. I walked toward her, holding up the notice. This must be a mistake. This is my spot. Her smirk widened, eyes gleaming with that particular kind of HOA superiority. Actually, Daniel, the board recently revised our parking regulations. The HOA owns all common areas now, including the parking lots. Residents need to apply for a permit, and unfortunately, she gave a mock sympathetic sigh. Yours wasn't approved. My jaw tightened. Approved? I own this spot. Not anymore. She turned to leave, but not before adding, if your car's still there tomorrow morning, it'll be towed. HOA rules, you understand. I clenched the paper in my fist. Something felt off about this. I needed to check my property records, because if she was lying, she was about to regret it. Frustration simmered in my chest as I stepped back inside, the crumpled violation notice still clenched in my fist. I tossed it onto the kitchen counter and exhaled, trying to steady the pulse of irritation hammering beneath my skin. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it felt deliberate, calculated. There was no way the HOA could suddenly claim ownership of a spot I had been using for years, not without some legal basis. Something about Meredith's smug certainty unsettled me, like she knew she could get away with this, like she had already anticipated whatever pushback I might try to muster. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. But she was wrong if she thought I would just roll over. I grabbed my laptop and slid into the chair at my dining table, the glow of the screen washing over me as I navigated to the county's property records database. It had been years since I'd last looked at my deed, buried somewhere in the depths of legal jargon I hadn't needed to revisit until now. My fingers drummed impatiently against the table as I pulled up the official documents, my eyes scanning through the plat map, lot boundaries, and ownership details. And then, just as my irritation threatened to boil over into something sharper, I saw it. My name wasn't just attached to my house, it extended beyond it. A slow realization crept over me as I traced the bold lines on the property map. The adjacent parking area, the very spot the HOA claimed as theirs, was outlined within my lot's boundary. Not just the single space outside my house, but a significant portion of the entire lot itself. My breath stilled for a moment, my mind grasping the implications. This wasn't just a clerical oversight. This was ownership, my ownership. The HOA didn't have the right to assign permits, didn't have the authority to regulate access, didn't have a single legal leg to stand on. The weight of the discovery settled over me, sending a sharp thrill of defiance through my veins. If Meredith had known this, then she was outright lying, banking on my ignorance, hoping I wouldn't question it. And if she hadn't known, then she was about to learn the hard way that she had just picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. I reached for my phone, already knowing the first call I needed to make. My sister, Ellie, had been dealing with property disputes for years, and if there was anyone who could confirm whether this was as monumental as it seemed, it was her. The phone barely rang twice before she answered, her voice edged with that ever-present sharpness that came from years of dealing with clients drowning in legal battles. "Danny? What's up?" I exhaled, still staring at the property records on my screen. You remember how I said my HOA was a nightmare? A tired sigh drifted through the speaker. What did they do this time? I leaned back, rubbing a hand over my jaw, the beginning of something resembling amusement flickering beneath the anger. They tried to take my parking spot, claimed the HOA owns it, but I just pulled up my property records. I hesitated for a beat, letting the words land with the full weight of what I had discovered. Ellie, I own the whole lot. A pause. Then a sharp inhale. Oh, she said slowly, the disbelief giving way to something almost gleeful. Oh, they screwed up, big time. A slow, knowing grin tugged at the corner of my mouth as I let my chair tip back slightly. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sheer audacity of the HOA's stunt still burned in the back of my mind, but now, armed with the truth, the anger had shifted into something sharper, an opportunity. They had tried to push me around, confident that I would back down like every other homeowner who had ever received one of their ridiculous notices. But today, I was going to show them just how wrong they were. I spent the better part of the morning assembling my evidence. I printed copies of my deed, the official plat map, and every legal document that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that the parking lot was mine. Ellie had even emailed over additional case law references, just in case they tried to challenge me with some HOA technicality. By the time I was done, I had a stack of paperwork that left no room for interpretation. They had trespassed onto my property and attempted to enforce rules they had no legal right to impose. By noon, I was standing at the HOA office, a modest but painfully polished building tucked neatly near the neighborhood's clubhouse. The receptionist barely looked up when I walked in, already absorbed in whatever monotonous task filled her day. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice the same artificial politeness that all HOA representatives seemed to have mastered. I set the paperwork down with a firm thud. "I need to speak to Meredith Langley." Her eyes flickered toward the documents before she pasted on a tight, unimpressed smile. "Do you have an appointment?" I returned the smile, though mine carried the weight of certainty. "Trust me, after she sees this, she's going to want to clear her schedule." The receptionist hesitated, eyeing me with the kind of suspicion reserved for residents who dared challenge the board. With a begrudging sigh, she disappeared into the back. I didn't have to wait long. Moments later, Meredith herself emerged, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing smirk as she stepped forward, radiating that same smug authority that made my blood simmer. She folded her arms, her voice carefully measured as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, if this is about your parking violation, I'm afraid the rules are very clear." I exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze with deliberate calm. Then I slid the first page of my deed across the counter, tapping the section where my ownership of the lot was outlined in black and white. Her smirk faltered. I leaned in slightly, my voice cool and steady. "No, Meredith, I think we need to talk about my parking lot." For a long moment, Meredith Langley didn't speak. Her eyes flicked over the paperwork I had just slid across the counter, the smooth veneer of her confidence cracking ever so slightly. I could see it, the calculation happening behind her gaze, the silent debate over whether she should feign ignorance, double down, or try to bluff her way out of this. Then, just as quickly as the hesitation appeared, she smoothed her expression and gave a tight, dismissive laugh. "Mr. Carter, I'm not sure where you found these documents, but I can assure you, our HOA records indicate that the parking lot is under association jurisdiction. Our legal team has already reviewed these boundaries extensively, and I doubt a quick online search changes that." I didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't let her condescending tone rattle me. Instead, I reached into my folder and pulled out one more document, an official zoning and ownership record from the county clerk's office, time-stamped and indisputable. "This isn't from a quick online search, Meredith. This is from the county land records office. Dated, signed, filed under my name. And if your so-called legal team missed this, you might want to reconsider who you're hiring." Her fingers twitched against the counter as her jaw locked tight, the condescending air around her replaced by something sharper, something colder. I could see it now. She was scrambling. Good. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly recognizing that this wasn't going how Meredith had expected. But Meredith wasn't going to concede easily. Regardless, she said, her voice clipped and firm, HOA policy takes precedence when it comes to community property regulations. You may own the land, but our bylaws allow us to manage usage, including parking assignments, to maintain neighborhood order. I laughed, a quiet, deliberate sound, shaking my head as I leaned forward. No, Meredith, your bylaws don't override property law. You can't manage what you don't own, and if you've been fining or towing people under false pretenses, that's fraud. The color in her face darkened ever so slightly. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to backpedal, but before she could speak, the office door behind her creaked open. A voice, calm and measured, cut through the tense silence. "What's going on here?" I turned, my pulse steady as I recognized Cynthia Holloway, the HOA treasurer, stepping into the room. Unlike Meredith, she didn't look irritated. She looked concerned. And as her eyes fell on the paperwork spread across the counter, I saw the first spark of doubt in her expression. This was about to get very interesting. Cynthia's entrance wasn't just a disruption. It was a shift in the atmosphere. Her presence had a weight to it, a sense of authority that made the tension in the room palpable. She glanced at Meredith, who was clearly trying to regain her composure, and then turned to me, her gaze sharper than I expected. There was a quiet calculation in her eyes, something beneath the surface that I couldn't quite read. She wasn't here just to support Meredith. I could feel it. "I assume this has to do with the parking dispute?" Cynthia's voice was smooth, almost clinical, as she nodded at the papers sprawled across the counter. I didn't waste time. "It's about more than a parking space, Cynthia. It's about the fact that the HOA is trespassing on my property, trying to control something they have no legal claim to." Meredith stepped in before Cynthia could respond, her voice louder now, defensive. "This is a misunderstanding. We're trying to maintain the integrity of the community, Daniel. The parking space isn't yours to do with as you please. We have regulations for a reason." I met her with a look that said everything. "Your regulations don't matter." But before I could say more, Cynthia interrupted. "Meredith," she said, her tone much softer, almost dismissive, "perhaps we should take a closer look at Daniel's claims before we escalate this any further." Meredith's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms and turned to face me, her posture shifting from dominance to a more defensive stance. "Fine, we'll review your evidence, Daniel. But be warned, this could turn ugly if it's not in your favor." I felt a flicker of doubt in Meredith's words, a crack in the armor she'd carefully built up around herself. Cynthia, on the other hand, seemed more intrigued than threatened. As she leaned in, she added, "Let's just make sure everyone's on the same page. I'll look into this matter myself, Daniel. You'll hear from me soon." But as she turned and walked out of the office, a thought struck me. Cynthia's sudden interest didn't feel like mere formality. It felt like she was searching for something. Maybe the truth, maybe leverage. Whatever it was, this wasn't just about parking spaces anymore. There were deeper currents at play, and I had just dipped my toes into something much bigger than I had anticipated. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the documents spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't quite finished assembling. The confrontation with Meredith and Cynthia had left me unsettled, not because I wasn't certain of my case, I had the law on my side, but because something about Cynthia's reaction nagged at me. She hadn't come to defend Meredith. She had come to assess the situation, to evaluate me as if she were trying to decide whether I was an obstacle or an opportunity. I barely noticed my phone vibrating against the table until the third ring snapped me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. "Ellie." "Please tell me you didn't let them talk you into backing down," she said the second I picked up. I let out a dry chuckle, rubbing a hand over my face. Not a chance. But something's off. Meredith was rattled, but Cynthia, she wasn't on board with whatever game Meredith was playing. She acted like she wanted to see the evidence for herself, like she had her own agenda. Ellie was quiet for a moment before exhaling. "That's interesting, because I did some digging today. The HOA's financials are a mess. There are discrepancies in their annual budget reports, missing allocations, funds that should have gone to community maintenance but didn't." She hesitated before adding, "If they've been running a scam, you owning that parking lot might be the least of their problems." I sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. I had just stepped onto the edge of something much, much bigger. The next morning, I walked out to my driveway, still thinking about what Ellie had said. Discrepancies in the HOA's financials? That explained Cynthia's odd reaction, but it also meant something else. Meredith wasn't just trying to enforce some arbitrary rule. She was covering something up. And if that was true, then me standing my ground wasn't just an inconvenience for her. It was a direct threat. I barely had time to process that thought before I stopped cold. My car was gone. For a moment, my mind refused to accept it. I scanned the lot, hoping I had somehow parked in a different spot, that I had made a mistake, but the empty space in front of my house mocked me. They towed me. A slow, hot anger curled in my chest as I turned, my eyes locking onto a brand new violation notice taped to the post nearby. Vehicle removed due to non-compliance with HOA parking regulations. I gritted my teeth, ripping the notice down as I reached for my phone. I didn't even have to think about who I was calling. The second Ellie picked up, I cut straight to it. They towed my car. What? Her voice was sharp, the single word laced with fury. They towed it, Ellie, on my own property. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. We're done playing nice. How fast can you draft a cease and desist? She didn't hesitate. Give me an hour. I hung up and turned toward the HOA office, my fists clenching at my sides. They thought they could intimidate me, that they could make me back down with cheap power plays. They had no idea that by pulling this stunt, they had just declared war. I didn't waste time. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I'd show them exactly how wrong they were. With the violation notice still crumpled in my fist, I grabbed my folder of legal documents and headed straight for the HOA office. My steps were steady, deliberate, my anger no longer a flash of heat but something colder, more controlled. They wanted a fight? Now they had one. The office was quiet when I stepped inside, the air thick with that artificial scent of lemon polish and control. The receptionist looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes, but before she could summon her usual robotic pleasantries, I spoke. "Where's Meredith?" She hesitated. "She's in a meeting. Not anymore." I pushed past her, heading for the hallway where I knew the board members gathered. The door to the conference room was cracked open just enough for me to see inside. Meredith and Cynthia sat at a long mahogany table, deep in conversation. They looked up just as I stepped in, the room's tense atmosphere shifting the moment they saw me. Meredith's face hardened. "Daniel, this is highly inappropriate." I didn't let her finish. I threw the violation notice onto the table, letting it land between them like a challenge. "You towed my car, off my property." My voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. "That's illegal, and you know it." Cynthia's eyes flickered to Meredith, and for the first time, I saw doubt. She hadn't known. Meredith, however, kept her face neutral, though I caught the faintest twitch in her jaw before she spoke. "Your vehicle was in a common area, and..." I cut her off with a slow shake of my head. "No, my property records say otherwise, and in case you think I'm bluffing..." I slid another paper across the table, this time the cease and desist letter Ellie had drafted. "This is your official notice. Return my vehicle, or I take legal action, and if you think I won't sue this HOA into the ground, try me." Meredith's eyes darkened. Cynthia, however, leaned forward, studying the document, and then for the first time she smiled. "Let's discuss this," she said. Meredith looked ready to explode. Meredith was seething. Her fingers curled so tightly around her pen that I half expected it to snap. But Cynthia, now leaning forward with an unreadable expression, was a different story entirely. The way she studied the cease and desist letter, her lips curling at the edges as if she'd just uncovered a hidden advantage, sent a ripple of intrigue through me. Whatever game she had been playing before, this was the moment she decided to switch sides, or at least pretend to. She exhaled slowly, setting the letter down with deliberate care before looking at Meredith. "This is serious," she said, her voice measured. "If Daniel's claim holds up, and from what I've seen it does, then the HOA is in violation of property laws. We can't afford to escalate this further." Meredith snapped her head toward her, eyes blazing. "You can't seriously be considering..." "I'm considering the fact that if Daniel takes this to court, we lose," Cynthia interrupted smoothly. "Not just the parking lot dispute, Meredith. If his attorney starts pulling financial records into discovery, who knows what else will come up? A flicker of something passed over Meredith's face. It was fast, but I caught it, a moment of genuine fear. That sealed it for me. Ellie was right. Something shady was going on with the HOA's finances, and Meredith was in the middle of it. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. "So what's it going to be?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately casual, though every muscle in my body was thrumming with tension. "You can return my car, restore my property rights, and issue a formal acknowledgement that the HOA overstepped. Or we can handle this in court. I'm fine with either." Meredith's nostrils flared, but it was Cynthia who spoke first. "We'll need to reconvene with legal counsel before making a decision," she said smoothly, already assuming a role of control that Meredith had clearly lost. "You'll have an answer by the end of the day." I stood, giving them both a slow nod before turning to leave. They were unraveling. I could feel it. And all I had to do was wait for the final thread to snap. I didn't have to wait long. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number, but I already knew who it was. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end was clipped, formal, a lawyer. "This is Richard Holcomb, legal counsel for the Stonebrook HOA. I'm calling to inform you that after reviewing your claims, we will be returning your vehicle immediately and retracting the violation." I smiled, but I wasn't stupid enough to think this was an admission of defeat. "That's a good start," I said evenly. "What about the property rights?" There was a pause. "The board will need more time to review the documents regarding ownership of the parking lot." "Right," I said, letting the silence stretch long enough to be uncomfortable. "Except you don't need more time. You already know I own it. The question now is, are you going to acknowledge that publicly, or do I need to file an injunction?" The silence on the other end was just a little too long. That told me everything I needed to know. They were scrambling. "Mr. Carter," Holcomb said, his voice measured, "we'd prefer to resolve this amicably. There's no need for legal action." "I agree," I said. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to put in writing that the HOA has no jurisdiction over my property. You're going to notify all residents that the HOA falsely enforced rules on land they don't own. And while you're at it, you're going to give me a full breakdown of your financial records. Because if you're pulling these stunts with parking lots, I'd love to see what else you've been up to." Another pause. Then Holcomb sighed. "I'll need to speak with the board." "Do that," I said. "And tell Meredith she has about 12 hours before I take this public." I hung up, exhaling as I stared at the evening sky through my kitchen window. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It never had been. They had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a private kingdom. That ended now. The next morning, I stood in my driveway, watching as a tow truck backed into the parking lot. A small group of neighbors had gathered, murmuring in hushed voices as the driver unhooked my car and lowered it back to my property, exactly where it belonged. The sheer pettiness of what the HOA had done wasn't lost on anyone. They had lost the first battle, but the war wasn't over yet. As the tow truck pulled away, I spotted Meredith standing near the HOA office, arms crossed, face tight with barely concealed rage. She knew what this meant. The moment the car was returned, people would start asking questions. The HOA never backed down, until now. I didn't bother waiting for her to come to me. I strode across the lot, feeling every pair of eyes locked onto us as I stopped just a few feet away from her. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" My voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the challenge beneath it. She inhaled sharply, forcing a tight smile. "We reviewed your documents and determined that a resolution outside of litigation was in the best interest of the community." I smirked. "That's a nice way of saying you had no case." Her eyes flashed, but before she could respond, Cynthia stepped forward. Unlike Meredith, she looked calm, collected, almost satisfied. "Daniel," she said smoothly, "we've also reviewed the property records in full. You're right, the HOA has no jurisdiction over the parking lot, and moving forward, all previous regulations regarding its use are void." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every resident who had been bullied into submission over the years. Meredith shot Cynthia a venomous look, but Cynthia ignored her. Instead, she met my gaze and added, Additionally, as per your request, the board will be conducting a full financial review. Meredith went pale. I smiled. I'm looking forward to seeing what you find. And just like that, the Queen of Stonebrook Estates was dethroned. By the time the official HOA announcement went out, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The email, stamped with Cynthia's name instead of Meredith's, confirmed what I had forced them to admit. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my parking lot or any of the other common spaces they had been enforcing rules on for years. But that was only the beginning. Less than 24 hours after the announcement, Ellie called me, her voice practically vibrating with energy. "Daniel," she said, "I just got the HOA's financial disclosures. You were right. It's bad." I grabbed my laptop and opened the email she forwarded, my eyes scanning the numbers. Funds were missing, thousands of dollars in maintenance fees that had been collected but never spent, payments made to businesses that didn't exist, and at the center of it all, Meredith Langley's signature on every single shady transaction. By the next HOA meeting, the usually quiet and compliant homeowners were angry. They packed into the community clubhouse, whispering to each other, waiting for the fireworks to start. And start they did. Cynthia stood at the front, flipping through pages of documents with the quiet confidence of someone who had seized power. "It has come to the board's attention that certain financial discrepancies require immediate review," she announced. And as of this moment, Meredith Langley has been relieved of her position as HOA president. A stunned silence filled the room before someone started clapping, then another and another. The room erupted. Meredith stood frozen, her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. I leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, watching as she stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her kingdom crumbling behind her. The HOA had spent years terrorizing homeowners, stealing money, and twisting rules to benefit the few. But all it had taken was one mistake, one parking violation sent to the wrong homeowner, to bring it all crashing down. And I wasn't done yet. The neighborhood felt different in the days that followed. There was a quiet shift in the air, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from Stonebrook Estates. People who had once avoided eye contact now greeted me when I walked outside. Conversations that had once been whispers behind closed doors turned into full-blown discussions in the middle of the street. For the first time in years, homeowners weren't afraid to speak up. Meredith Langley had vanished. No emails, no notices, not even a final statement. She had been erased from the HOA overnight, her name stripped from every document, her reign over in disgrace. But her problems were far from over. Ellie kept me updated. With the financial discrepancies made public, an official audit had been launched. The HOA had been bleeding money for years, and now that the truth was out, legal action was inevitable. Meredith had once believed she was untouchable. Now she was just another name on an investigation report. As for me, I still owned the parking lot. And for the first time since this battle started, I stood in it, staring at the once pristine HOA-controlled asphalt that now belonged exclusively to me. I thought about selling it to the community, turning it into a space for the neighborhood to use freely. But then again, I also considered something more fitting, charging the HOA rent. After all, they had spent years making people pay for things they didn't own. It was only fair to return the favor. What happened in Stonebrook Estates wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about power, the kind that goes unchecked for too long, that convinces people they can rewrite the rules just because no one has dared to challenge them. The HOA had spent years controlling homeowners, making them believe they had no choice but to comply. But as it turned out, all it took was one person willing to fight back to unravel the entire system. If you've ever dealt with an overreaching HOA, a corrupt authority, or a situation where you felt powerless against a rigged system, this story should serve as proof. Knowledge is power. When you know your rights, when you take the time to dig beneath the surface, you might just find that the very people enforcing the rules are the ones breaking them the most. So what would you have done? Would you have fought back, or would you have let them take the parking space and move on? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if you've ever dealt with HOA nightmares, unfair policies, or power-hungry board members, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because at the end of the day, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning a fight. It's about reminding the people in power that they only have as much control as we allow them to have. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because trust me, there's always more where this came from.